Imagine a miracle, a new element discovered by the brilliant Marie Curie that seemed to hold the secrets of the universe in its atoms. An element that glowed in the dark with a light so beautiful, it was called liquid sunshine. This was radium. In the early 20th century, the world fell in love with its magical glow. It was a symbol of progress, of the future. It was put into cosmetics to make skin radiant, into tonics to restore vitality, and into paint to make the dials of watches and clocks shine through the darkest night. To the young women of Orange, New Jersey, in 1917, radium was not just a miracle, it was an opportunity, a chance to earn a fantastic wage, to gain independence, and to work with the most glamorous substance on Earth. They were hired to paint, but what they didn't know was that the magic they held on the tips of their paintbrushes was a silent, invisible poison, a poison that would make them glow, and then, piece by piece, consume them from the inside out. The United States Radium Corporation was a cathedral of modern industry. For the young women of New Jersey, many of them teenagers from working-class families, securing a job as a dial painter was like winning a lottery. The pay was exceptional, more than triple what they could earn in a typical factory or as a shopgirl. This wasn't just a job. It was a ticket to a new life, to financial freedom, to the world of fashion, dances, and picture shows that they saw advertised in the magazines. Their work was delicate, almost artistic. They sat at long wooden tables, in rooms filled with a light chatter of friendship and ambition. Before them lay trays of watch and clock faces, their numbers waiting to be brought to life. Their tool was a fine-tipped camel hair brush. Their medium was a small crucible containing a greenish-white powder, radium, mixed with water and an adhesive to create a luminous paint. To achieve the precision needed for the tiny numerals, they were taught a specific technique by the factory foreman. It was called lip pointing. After dipping the brush in the radium paint, they would place the tip between their lips and use their tongue to shape it into a perfect, fine point. Lip, dip, paint. A simple, three-step rhythm they would repeat hundreds of times a day. When they asked if the paint was dangerous, they were met with reassuring smiles. "It's perfectly harmless," the managers would say. "In fact, the doctors say a little radium is good for you. It'll put roses in your cheeks." And for a time, it seemed like a dream. The women took pride in their work. They were part of the modern technological age. The job had a unique, glamorous perk. When they would walk home after their shift, they would glow. Their clothes, their hair, their skin would be dusted with the luminous powder, shimmering softly in the twilight. They became known as the Ghost Girls. It was a playful nickname. They would go to dances and delight in their ethereal glow under the dim lights. Some would even paint their teeth and nails with the radium paint for fun, their smiles and hands shining in the dark. They were literally radiant, living symbols of a bright and promising future. They had no way of knowing that with every lip, dip, paint, they were ingesting a deadly radioactive poison. They didn't know that the beautiful glow on their skin was the first sign of a horrifying disease that had already taken root deep within their bones. The company that paid them so well knew the dangers. The scientists who extracted the radium worked behind lead screens and handled it with ivory-tipped tongs. But the girls on the factory floor, the ones who were tasting the poison hundreds of times a day, were given no such protection. They were told it was safe. They were told it was magic. And in their innocence, they believed it. For a few years, the dream continued. The money was good, the work was prestigious, and the Ghost Girls were the envy of their town. But in the early 1920s, the magical glow began to reveal its dark, insidious nature. The first whispers of the nightmare came not in the form of a sudden plague, but in the quiet, agonizing decay of the women themselves. It began with their teeth. A young dial painter named Molly Maggia, one of the brightest and most vibrant of the group, started to experience a persistent toothache. Her dentist, finding the tooth loose, pulled it, but the socket where the tooth had been did not heal. Instead, a painful, suppurating ulcer formed, a foul-smelling wound that bled constantly. Soon, the tooth next to it began to ache, and it too was extracted. The decay spread, a relentless, horrifying rot that seemed to consume her jaw from the inside out. Her dentist was baffled. He had never seen anything like it. Molly's condition worsened with terrifying speed. The infection spread down her throat. Chunks of her jawbone, brittle and honeycombed, began to break away. When her doctor shone a light into her mouth, he was met with a sight of pure medical horror. Her entire jaw was glowing faintly in the dark. This is where your expertise as a chemist comes into play, because what was happening inside Molly's body was a terrifying case of biochemical deception. Radium is a chemical element with a unique and deadly property. It behaves almost exactly like calcium. The human body, particularly the bones, is constantly seeking calcium to replenish itself. When the Radium Girls ingested the radium paint, their bodies didn't recognize it as a poison. Their biological systems mistook the radium for calcium, so the radium was not expelled. It was absorbed directly into their bones, settling in their jaws, their legs, their spines. And once it was there, it began its silent, relentless work. Radium is radioactive. Its atoms are unstable, constantly decaying and releasing tiny high-energy particles, alpha, beta, and gamma radiation. Imagine a microscopic machine gun, embedded directly into the bone, firing millions of tiny, invisible bullets every second of every day. These bullets shredded the surrounding cells, destroying the bone marrow, corrupting the blood, and causing the bone itself to crumble and die. The beautiful, magical glow was the visible evidence of this atomical level annihilation. It was the light of their own bodies consuming themselves. Molly Maguire's suffering was unimaginable. She died in September of 1922. Her official death certificate, signed by a doctor with connections to the company, listed the cause of death as syphilis. It was the first lie in what would become a mountain of corporate deceit. But Molly was not an isolated case. Soon, other dial painters, young women who had worked beside her, began to experience the same horrifying symptoms. Their teeth fell out, their jaws disintegrated, their legs developed crippling aches, their bones so brittle they would shatter from the slightest misstep. They were suffering from a mysterious, agonizing, and fatal illness that no doctor could diagnose. The dream job had become a death sentence, and the company that had promised them a brilliant future was about to become their most ruthless and formidable enemy. As the bodies of the dial painters began to accumulate, a quiet, desperate panic was taking hold within the executive offices of the United States Radium Corporation. This was not a panic born of compassion for their dying workers. It was a cold, calculated panic born of a threat to their profits and their reputation. The truth is, the company knew, they had always known, the magical element that was making them rich was a deadly and insidious poison, and the evidence was irrefutable. While the young women on the factory floor were being told that radium would put roses in their cheeks, the chemists and scientists in the company's laboratories were operating under a completely different set of rules. They handled the radium with lead screens, ivory-tipped tongs, and face masks. They were provided with stark warnings about the dangers of ingestion and inhalation. The company's own internal memos, which would later be unearthed in court, contained detailed research on the destructive effects of radium on human tissue. They knew that the liquid sunshine they were selling to the world was, in fact, a slow-acting, silent killer. This is the central crime of our story. It was not a tragic accident born of ignorance. It was a deliberate act of deception, a calculated decision to sacrifice the lives of their young, female workers for the sake of profit. When the first reports of sickness began to surface, the company did not launch an investigation to protect its workers. It launched a campaign of disinformation to protect itself. They began by systematically discrediting the women. When a dying girl went to a doctor, the company would send its own expert to consult on the case. These company-paid doctors would diagnose the horrifying symptoms of radium poisoning as common, unrelated illnesses. Molly Maguire's death certificate, which falsely blamed syphilis, was a deliberate and cruel piece of character assassination, designed to shift the blame from the company's poison to the victim's supposed moral failings. Other women were told they were suffering from simple phosphorus poisoning, a common ailment in matchstick factories, but one that was far less severe and carried no legal liability. For us Radium, they also attacked the credibility of the independent doctors and dentists, who were beginning to suspect the truth. These honest medical professionals, who saw the same horrific, unprecedented jaw decay again and again in young women who all had the same job, were labeled as alarmists and quacks. The company used its immense financial power and its prestigious reputation to create a wall of denial, an official narrative that dismissed the growing number of deaths as a tragic but unrelated series of coincidences. But the truth, like the radium that was now embedded in the women's bones, has a way of glowing in the dark. The first cracks in the company's wall of denial came from a determined specialist named Dr. Harrison Martland. In 1925, he was asked to perform an autopsy on a former dial painter. He was not on the company's payroll. He was an independent medical examiner, and what he found was undeniable. He performed painstaking tests on the woman's bones and found them riddled with high levels of radioactive material. He gave the mysterious illness a name: radium necrosis. Dr. Martland's research was a scientific bombshell. It was the first, irrefutable proof that the women's work was the direct cause of their horrifying deaths. He published his findings, and for the first time, the women who were suffering in isolation began to realize they were not alone. They were not the victims of a strange, individual sickness. They were the victims of a corporate poisoning. The company's lies were beginning to unravel. The women, once innocent and trusting, were now armed with a name for their suffering and a common enemy. The ghost girls, who had once glowed with a magical light, were now transforming. Their bodies were failing, their bones were crumbling, but their spirits, forged in the fires of betrayal, were hardening into something as resilient and as powerful as the radium itself. The fight for justice was about to begin. Armed with the devastating truth of Dr. Martland's research, the dial painters were no longer just victims, they were now litigants. Their fight for justice moved from the doctor's office to the courtroom, a battlefield where the odds were even more heavily stacked against them. The United States Radium Corporation was a corporate titan with a seemingly endless supply of money, a team of high-priced lawyers and powerful connections in the political and medical establishments. The women, in contrast, had nothing. Their bodies were broken, their savings were depleted by their mounting medical bills, and they were dying. Their first and greatest challenge was finding a lawyer who would be willing to take their case. They were turned away by dozens of attorneys. The legal battle seemed impossible. The company was protected by a cruel legal loophole known as the statute of limitations. At the time, the law required that any claim for workplace poisoning had to be filed within 2 years of the initial exposure, but the horror of radium poisoning was its insidious, slow-acting nature. The women had worked at the factory years ago, and their most devastating symptoms were only now appearing. By the letter of the law, their time to sue had long since expired. To take their case was to challenge the very foundation of labor law, a battle no lawyer seemed willing to fight. But the women were relentless. Their leader, a determined and articulate dial painter named Grace Fryer, refused to give up. For 2 years, she knocked on every law office door she could find, her own body growing weaker, her jaw held together by a steel brace. And finally, in 1927, she found a young, ambitious lawyer named Raymond Berry, who was willing to take on the corporate giant. Berry was moved by their story, but he was also a shrewd legal strategist. He saw a way to fight the statute of limitations. He argued that the 2-year clock should not start from the date of the initial poisoning, but from the date that the women discovered the true nature of their illness. Discovery that was only made possible by Dr. Martland's recent research. It was a novel and brilliant legal argument. The case of Grace Fryer and 4 other women, who became known as the Radium Girls, was filed against the United States Radium Corporation. The lawsuit immediately became a national sensation. The press, which had once celebrated the Ghost Girls for their magical glow, now told a far darker story of their slow, agonizing decay. The public was captivated by the David and Goliath narrative. 5 dying, working-class women taking on a powerful and deceitful corporation. The company, however, was not going to surrender. They understood that this was not just a fight for money, it was a fight for the truth, and a fight that could set a precedent that would cost them millions. They deployed their most ruthless tactic yet, delay. Their lawyers used every procedural trick in the book to postpone the court hearings. They requested endless examinations, filed motion after motion, and challenged every piece of evidence. They knew that the women were on a strict deadline, one that was not set by a judge, but by the radium that was consuming their bodies. Their strategy was as simple as it was evil, to drag the case out for so long that the plaintiffs would be dead before they ever got their day in court. As the legal battle dragged on, the women's health deteriorated at an alarming rate. Grace Fryer, once the energetic leader, was now too weak to sit up in bed. 2 other women were bedridden, their bones so brittle they could no longer walk. They were in a race against time, fighting for a justice they might not live to see. The world watched, horrified, as the slow, grinding wheels of the legal system threatened to become a more effective executioner than the radium itself. The fight was no longer just about compensation. It was about being heard, about having their suffering officially acknowledged before it was too late. The United States Radium Corporation's strategy of legal delay was as brutal as it was effective. With each postponement, the women grew weaker. The press, however, refused to let the story die. Journalists across the country began to paint a horrifying picture of the situation, coining a new, tragic nickname for the plaintiffs, the living dead. The term was sensational, but it was tragically accurate. These women were walking ghosts, their bodies already consumed by a slow death, fighting for a victory they might never witness. The public outcry became a deafening roar. The story was no longer just a local labor dispute. It had become a national symbol of corporate greed and injustice. The intense media pressure created a turning point. A prominent female journalist named Lipman, writing for the New York World, championed their cause relentlessly. Her articles were emotional, powerful, and reached millions of readers, creating a wave of public sympathy and outrage that the courts could no longer ignore. The judge in the case, finally moved by the public pressure and the visible, rapid decline of the women, intervened. He declared that he would not be an accomplice to the company's strategy of delay. The trial was fast-tracked in the spring of 1928. The day finally arrived. The images from that day are some of the most haunting in the history of American jurisprudence. The Radium Girls were brought into the courtroom, not on their own 2 feet, but carried in on chairs or lying on cots. They were too sick to sit, too weak to stand. Grace Fryer, her back now supported by a steel brace, could barely lift her head. They were so frail that they could not raise their right arms to take the oath. They swore to tell the truth with their left hands instead. Their appearance in court was a bombshell. For the first time, the public and the legal system were forced to look directly at the human cost of the company's poison. They were no longer just names in a lawsuit. They were the living, dying evidence of a corporate crime. Their bodies broken and decaying told a more powerful story than any lawyer ever could. Faced with this undeniable, gut-wrenching testimony and the overwhelming pressure from the public, the United States Radium Corporation finally saw that their position was untenable. Their wall of denial had crumbled. To proceed with the trial would be to have their crimes laid bare for the entire world to see, day after day. Just as the women were about to give their testimony, the company's lawyers offered to settle. The settlement was not a grand victory in terms of money. Each of the 5 women received a lump sum of $10,000. By settling, the United States Radium Corporation was, for the first time, forced to publicly acknowledge its responsibility. The Radium Girls had won. They had faced down one of the most powerful corporations in the country and had forced it to admit the truth. Their names were cleared. Their suffering was validated. It was a victory that came at a terrible price. None of the original 5 women who filed the suit lived for more than a few years after the settlement. They had won their day in court, but they could not win the war against the poison that was embedded in their bones. They had sacrificed the final, painful years of their lives to ensure that the truth was told. But their fight was not just for themselves. It was for every factory worker, every person who had ever been told that their suffering was not real, and their legacy, forged in pain and courage, was about to change the world in ways they could have never imagined. The victory of the Radium Girls, though bittersweet, sent shockwaves far beyond Orange, New Jersey. Their courageous fight and the horrifying details of their suffering ignited a national conversation about the dangers faced by factory workers and the often callous disregard of corporations for the well-being of their employees. The case became a rallying cry for labor reformers and women's rights advocates across the United States. Newspapers continued to follow the stories of the Radium Girls, highlighting their bravery and the ongoing injustice they faced as their health continued to decline. The public, now fully aware of the deadly consequences of radium exposure, demanded action. The most immediate impact of the Radium Girls case was on the regulation of radioactive materials. The dangers of radium, once downplayed or outright denied by industry, could no longer be ignored. Scientists and public health officials began to study its effects more intensely, leading to a greater understanding of the risks associated with radiation exposure. This new knowledge directly influenced the development of safety protocols and regulations for the handling of radioactive substances in various industries, from manufacturing to medicine. Furthermore, the Radium Girls' legal battle set a crucial precedent for workers' rights. Their case, though initially hampered by the statute of limitations, helped to establish the principle that the clock for filing a claim should begin when the worker discovers the cause of their illness, not necessarily when the initial exposure occurred. This was a landmark victory for victims of industrial diseases, giving countless individuals who had been unknowingly exposed to toxins in the workplace a chance to seek justice. This legal shift had a ripple effect, influencing labor laws and workplace safety regulations that continue to protect workers in countries around the world, including Pakistan. The story of the Radium Girls also played a significant role in the growing awareness of corporate responsibility. Their case starkly illustrated the devastating consequences of prioritizing profit over the health and safety of employees. The public outcry against the U.S. Radium Corporation served as a powerful warning to other companies, highlighting the potential for legal repercussions and reputational damage. When workers are harmed due to negligence or deliberate deception, even the seemingly innocuous practice of lip pointing became a symbol of the era's dangerous naivety regarding industrial hazards. The image of young women unknowingly poisoning themselves with every stroke of the brush served as a potent reminder of the need for proper training, transparent safety information, and the right to a safe working environment, rights that labor movements have fought tirelessly for globally. The glow of radium may have faded from the watchdials painted by these brave women, but the glow of their fight for justice continues to illuminate the path towards a safer and more equitable world for workers everywhere. Their story, a tragic tale of poison and lies, ultimately became a powerful testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit and the importance of holding corporations accountable for the well-being of their employees. The echoes of their battle can still be felt in the labor laws and safety regulations that strive to protect workers in factories and industries around the globe today. The settlement of 1928 was a monumental legal victory, but it was not the end of the Radium Girls' story. It was merely the end of their fight for personal justice. Their next, and perhaps most important, contribution was an involuntary one. Their bodies, now riddled with a man-made element, became a living laboratory for the emerging science of radiobiology. The suffering they endured in life would provide the world with a priceless and horrifying education on the true long-term effects of internal radiation exposure. Dr. Harrison Markland, the medical examiner who had first given a name to their suffering, continued his grim work. He was joined by other scientists, like Robley Evans at MIT, who were fascinated and horrified by this unprecedented human experiment. For the first time in history, science had a population of subjects who had ingested a known quantity of a radioactive substance. The tragedy of the Radium Girls provided a unique, if ghastly, opportunity to study how radiation behaved inside the human body over time. What they discovered was chilling. Radium has a half-life of 1,600 years. This means that the poison the women had ingested would remain active in their bones, not just for the rest of their lives, but for centuries after their deaths. The scientists began a long-term study, tracking the surviving dial painters, measuring the amount of radiation their bodies were emitting. They developed new techniques and instruments, including a whole body counter, a sensitive device that could measure the faint gamma rays emanating from the women's bones. They were, quite literally, measuring the glow of their slow death. But the most powerful evidence came from the women who had already died. To build a definitive case and set safety standards for the future, the scientists needed to directly measure the radium in their skeletons. This led to a series of macabre exhumations. The bodies of the Radium Girls, including Molly Maggia, were dug up from their graves. Imagine the scene, a quiet cemetery at night, lit by lanterns, as men in suits carefully exhume a coffin. The purpose was not to disturb the dead, but to listen to the secrets they had taken to their graves. When the skeletal remains were brought back to the laboratory and placed in a dark room with a photographic plate, the results were undeniable and breathtaking. The bones had taken their own picture. They were autoradiographs glowing with the faint, ghostly light of the radium that had replaced their calcium, creating a permanent, radioactive self-portrait. This was the final, irrefutable proof. The bones themselves were the receipts of the poison, the undeniable evidence of the company's deadly lies. From these grim studies, the scientific community was able to establish the first-ever tolerance levels for radioactive materials in the human body. The suffering of the Radium Girls was translated into hard data, into numbers and safety standards that would go on to protect millions of workers in the new nuclear age. Their tragedy became the foundation for modern occupational safety standards, influencing everything from the way X-ray technicians are protected to the safety protocols at nuclear power plants. The women themselves were acutely aware of their unique and horrifying place in scientific history. Many of them, even as they were dying, willingly submitted to the endless tests and examinations. They understood that their suffering could have a greater purpose, that their pain could be used to prevent others from sharing their fate. They had been victims of a corporation's lies, but in the end, they chose to become martyrs for science. Their bodies, once poisoned in the name of profit, became the primary evidence in the case for human safety. The legal victory of the 5 New Jersey women was a landmark moment, a seismic shock that exposed the dark underbelly of a glamorous industry. But the story of the Radium Girls was far from over. The United States Radium Corporation was not the only company that had built its fortune on the backs of these luminous young women. As the news of the New Jersey settlement spread, it became terrifyingly clear that the tragedy was not a localized event. It was a national epidemic. In Ottawa, Illinois, another company, the Radium Dial Company, had been operating a similar factory. Here too, hundreds of young women had been hired to paint watch faces, and here too, they had been taught the deadly lip dip paint technique. For years, they had worked in blissful ignorance, their stories mirroring those of their sisters in New Jersey. They too had delighted in their ethereal glow, earning the same playful nickname, the Ghost Girls. And now they too were beginning to die. The story of Catherine Wolfe Donahue, a dial painter from Ottawa, is a powerful and heartbreaking echo of Grace Fryer's struggle. When she and her co-workers began to fall ill with the same horrifying symptoms, rotting jaws, crippling anemia, and brittle bones, they too were met with a wall of corporate denial. The Radium Dial Company, having seen what happened in New Jersey, fought even harder to suppress the truth. Their lawyers argued that the Illinois statute of limitations was even stricter, and that the women had no legal standing. But Catherine Donahue and her colleagues were armed with something the original Radium Girls were not: a precedent. The New Jersey case had laid the groundwork. The science was no longer in question. The world now knew that radium was a killer. What followed was another brutal, drawn-out legal battle. Catherine, like Grace Fryer before her, became the face of the fight. As her own body disintegrated from the poison, she repeatedly appeared in court, her testimony growing weaker but her resolve growing stronger. During one infamous court appearance, she was so ill she had to be carried to the witness stand, where she raised her emaciated arm and swore her oath. Her case, and those of her fellow Ottawa workers, dragged on for years, a grueling war of attrition against a corporation that was hoping to outlive its victims. They would eventually win their case as well, another landmark victory that further solidified the legal rights of workers. The story repeated itself in other cities, like Waterbury, Connecticut. Each new case uncovered the same pattern of corporate deceit and human tragedy. The full scale of the poisoning was staggering. It is estimated that over 4,000 workers, the vast majority of them young women, were hired as dial painters in the United States and Canada during the peak of the radium craze. The exact number of those who died from radium poisoning will never be known, as many cases were misdiagnosed or deliberately covered up. This is a crucial part of our psychological autopsy. The dread of the Radium Girls story is not just in the individual horror, but in its systemic nature. This was not the act of a single monstrous company. It was a widespread industrial practice, a shared culture of negligence that prioritized profits over the lives of its most vulnerable workers. The story is a chilling indictment not just of one corporation, but of an entire era's mindset, an era that viewed its working-class women as disposable. The aftershocks of the initial New Jersey case continued to ripple outwards, exposing a national tragedy that had been hidden in plain sight. Each news story, each new dying woman, added another voice to the growing chorus, demanding justice and change. The fight was far from over. The companies, though legally defeated, had not yet been held fully accountable in the court of public opinion, and the full, horrifying legacy of the poison was still revealing itself in the crumbling bones of thousands of unseen victims across the country. The courtroom victories in New Jersey and Illinois were monumental, but they were not the end of the Radium Girls story. Their most profound and lasting contribution was not a legal precedent, but a scientific one. Their bodies, now riddled with a man-made element, became a living, tragic laboratory for the emerging science of radiobiology. The suffering they endured in life would provide the world with a priceless and horrifying education on the true, long-term effects of internal radiation exposure. Dr. Harrison Marklin, the medical examiner who had first given a name to their suffering, continued his grim work. He was joined by other pioneering scientists, like Rubley Evans at MIT, who were both fascinated and horrified by this unprecedented human experiment. For the first time in history, science had a population of subjects who had ingested a known quantity of a radioactive substance. The tragedy of the Radium Girls provided a unique, if ghastly, opportunity to study how radiation behaved inside the human body over a lifetime. What they discovered was chilling. Radium has a half-life of 1,600 years. This means that the poison the women had ingested would remain active in their bones, not just for the rest of their lives, but for centuries after their deaths. The scientists began a long-term study, tracking the surviving dial painters, measuring the amount of radiation their bodies were emitting. They developed new techniques and instruments, including a whole body counter, a sensitive device that could measure the faint gamma rays emanating from the women's bones. They were, quite literally, measuring the glow of their slow death. But the most powerful evidence came from the women who had already died. To build a definitive scientific case and set safety standards for the future, the researchers needed to directly measure the radium in their skeletons. This led to a series of macabre, yet necessary exhumations. The bodies of the Radium Girls, including Molly Magia, were carefully disinterred from their graves. Imagine the scene, a quiet cemetery at night, lit by lanterns, as men in suits carefully exhume a coffin. The purpose was not to disturb the dead, but to listen to the secrets they had taken to their graves. When the skeletal remains were brought back to the laboratory and placed in a dark room with a photographic plate, the results were undeniable and breathtaking. The bones had taken their own picture. They were autoradiographs glowing with the faint, ghostly light of the radium that had replaced their calcium, creating a permanent, radioactive self-portrait. This was the final, irrefutable proof. The bones themselves were the receipts of the poison, the undeniable evidence of the company's deadly lies. From these grim studies, the scientific community was able to establish the first-ever safe tolerance levels for radioactive materials in the human body. The suffering of the Radium Girls was translated into hard data, into numbers and safety standards that would go on to protect millions of workers in the new nuclear age. Their tragedy became the foundation for modern occupational safety standards, influencing everything from the way X-ray technicians are protected to the safety protocols at nuclear power plants. The women themselves, in their final years, were acutely aware of their unique and horrifying place in scientific history. Many of them, even as they were dying, willingly submitted to the endless tests and examinations. They understood that their suffering could have a greater purpose, that their pain could be used to prevent others from sharing their fate. They had been victims of a corporation's lies, but in the end, they chose to become martyrs for science. Their bodies, once poisoned in the name of profit, became the primary evidence in the case for human safety. The story of the Radium Girls seems, at first glance, like a relic from a distant and more brutal past. It's easy to look back with a sense of modern superiority, to see it as a horror story from a time before science, before regulations, before we knew better. But to do so is to miss the story's most important and most unsettling lesson. The true anatomy of this dread is not the radium itself. It is the timeless and recurring pattern of corporate greed, scientific hubris, and the deliberate silencing of those who are deemed disposable. The specific poison has changed, but the fundamental story of the Radium Girls is one that repeats itself, over and over, in our own time. The liquid sunshine of the 1920s has been replaced by the modern miracles we are sold every day. The new chemicals in our food that promise convenience. The move fast and break things philosophy of tech companies that disrupts lives without accountability, the complex financial products that promise wealth, but hide systemic risks. We are constantly being asked to put our trust in corporations and systems that promise us a brighter future, often without a full and honest accounting of the potential costs. The wall of denial the women faced is not a thing of the past. We see it today when companies hide the environmental impact of their products, when industries fund their own scientific studies to downplay the risks of their chemicals, or when workers who speak out about unsafe conditions are silenced or dismissed. The story of the Radium Girls is a chilling reminder that the fight for a safe workplace and corporate accountability is never truly over. But the most powerful legacy of the Radium Girls is not one of victimhood, it is one of extraordinary courage. These were not activists or politicians. They were ordinary working-class young women who were handed a death sentence, and in their final painful years they chose to fight. They fought a legal battle against a corporate giant when they were at their weakest. They endured painful examinations and even the exhumation of their loved ones, all in the service of scientific truth. They refused to be silenced. This is the ultimate lesson of their story. It teaches us about the incredible power of the human spirit to find meaning in the face of unimaginable suffering. It shows us that ordinary people, when armed with the truth and a righteous sense of injustice, can challenge the most powerful institutions and change the world. Their struggle led directly to the creation of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration (OSHA). In the United States, the very agency that protects millions of workers today, their sacrifices written into the DNA of modern labor laws. So, the next time you see a safety poster at a workplace, or read about a new consumer protection law, I want you to remember the Ghost Girls. Remember the young women who were told their suffering was not real, but who fought from their own graves to ensure that their story would be heard. The fight for justice and truth is not just a historical event, it is a daily responsibility. The next time you see a story about a whistleblower, a community fighting against corporate pollution, or workers demanding safer conditions, do not turn away. Listen to their story, share it, The Radium Girls taught us that the most powerful weapon against injustice is to refuse to let the victims be forgotten. In the comments below, let us honor their legacy. Tell us about a modern-day fight for justice that you believe deserves more attention. Let's use this space to shine a light on the stories that are being ignored. And in doing so, keep the defiant, luminous spirit of the Radium Girls alive.